I'm Ebony Bennett, Deputy Director at the Australia Institute, and welcome to our webinar series, Unparliamentary, our fortnightly show where we bring you all the latest things that are happening in federal parliament. And I'm super excited to be joined by our special guest journalist, Karen Middleton, today. Thanks for joining us, Karen.
Thanks, Ebony.
Karen is political editor at Guardian Australia, and the big political story over the weekend was obviously the Queensland election, where the LNP won a narrower than expected victory over a long-standing Labor government. The coalition party room discipline has been tested after Senator Jacinta Nampijinpa-Price made anti-abortion comments that were seen by her colleagues as unhelpful ahead of the Queensland and federal elections. And obviously, we're just a week out from a huge presidential election in the United States, which could have major consequences for Australia and the rest of the world. I also should acknowledge that I live and work on Ngunnawal and Ngambri country and pay my respects to elders past and present. And just a few quick tips for Zoom before we dive in. You can type in questions for Karen into the Q&A box. You can also upvote other people's questions and vote on them as well. And a reminder to please keep things civil and on topic in the chat or we'll boot you out. And lastly, a reminder that this discussion is being recorded and it will go up on our website later this afternoon. Thanks so much for joining us, Karen. I think we probably should start with the Queensland election. It was a much narrower victory. There'd been a predicted wipeout for Labor for many, many months, but much closer than anyone would have anticipated, though the LNP looks to have secured majority government.
Yeah, that's right. It was really a bit of a slow burn on Saturday night. I think early on there was a suggestion that maybe it was going to be even closer than it has appeared. I think what happened looks like a couple of things occurred. Firstly, the populist policies of the Miles government towards the end of his time in office, particularly the 50-cent transport fares and a number of those measures have appealed to people, it seems, and clawed back a little bit of support that they were losing. And maybe that debate at the end, and I know we'll come to that, and you mentioned it just before, that the abortion debate certainly provided an opportunity for Stephen Miles, the Premier, the Labor Premier, to be the conviction guy, be the guy that is strongly defending something and someone, an issue or a position. And so I think certainly Labor is seems to feel that some of the vote they may have lost to the Greens has come back or has stayed with Labor, and that's done them, well. But in the end, it is actually a pretty substantive victory to the LNP. And if Labor's looking at it now, they'd be a bit worried about things like the outer metro areas and the regions where they've struggled for a while. But certainly they would have been hoping, I think, that the outer metro areas of cities like Brisbane were coming back a bit better for them than they are. And there'll be a lot of anxiety, I think, about that when you look ahead to the federal election, because
Mm.
they haven't done terribly well in Queensland. They lost 2 Labor seats to the Greens last election. They'll be clinging to the hope that some of that Green result, which was not as good as the Greens had hoped, might bode well for trying to get those seats back. But it was a pretty mixed result, and overall not a huge amount to celebrate for the Labor Party, either in the Queensland result itself or in what it says looking ahead.
Yeah, although certainly better than when, they got absolutely wiped out and Palaszczuk first became opposition leader. It does look like Labor really managed to save the furniture. The Australia Institute did polling on a lot of those Queensland Labor election platforms like the 50-cent public transport and free school lunches and things like that. And they did prove to be really popular. And certainly looking from the results, it looks like Labor did a lot better on votes on the day than they did in the pre-poll. And do you think, there's a bit of a lesson there that actually some of those policies really did work and cut through for Labor?
Yeah, potentially. And there's a lot of hand wringing now about how long we give voters to pre-poll. You know, they're on the night. Annika Wells, the aged care minister federally, who's a Queenslander, made the comment that you know, sort of a grumble. And we always love, I should, as a sidebar, we love election night coverage because people unburden themselves, Ebony, you know, whether it's state or federal election, there's like this window in time. And when I say we, I'm talking about us vulture journos, you know, people are a bit more frank for this short sort of window in time while the votes are being counted than they might be, certainly than they more than they would be the day before or even, you know, while people are voting. And even afterwards, they're not as frank. So there's this tiny little window that where they're honest. And Annika Wells had a bit of a spray about pre-poll voting and how long people get to vote in advance, and saying that this is a frustration because it saps resources from the parties because they have to staff these booths for weeks in advance, and it also means they can't get their messages out. People are voting without having heard the whole argument. And while I have some sympathy for that argument, I do also think that that does suggest that maybe the political parties should lay their policies out a little bit earlier and give us a chance to understand them. So they all have these strategies and tactics that they want to employ. And pre-polling can put the kibosh on that a bit, because if they are wanting to back end load an election campaign with exciting things, if people are starting to vote earlier, and we are all seemingly inclined to do that more, it does complicate the equation, and it's going to change the nature of campaigning. And I think it already is. And I think we'll probably see that with the federal election too, because they're not going to change the pre-poll timing for the federal election.
Mm, mm. So the Labor leadership now will probably be thrown open to a vote under its state party rules. Do you think Stephen Miles has done enough to retain the leadership?
Well, I don't profess to be an expert on Queensland state politics, so I'm not. I would defer to my Queensland colleagues on that point. I think it's interesting that he's sort of clearly indicated that that's what he wants. And again, harking back to the coverage on Saturday night, you know, Cameron Dick was on, I think, the ABC's panel, and it was, you know, gave a fair indication he was sort of hedging around who would be the future leader, but certainly gave rise to speculation and conversation that he was angling that perhaps he would be the future leader and that Stephen Miles might step back. So, you know, there were signs of disappointment early on from at least one other potential contender. Whether that means there will be a contest, and I would imagine a number of them. And this is standard for politics when a government loses and there's a, you know, opposition leader's job up for grabs. There'll be a lot of people on the phone trying to work out what the best option is, whether the best option is to stick with Stephen Miles, whether he did enough in that 10 months, and certainly whether he clawed back enough, to your point about saving the furniture, whether that is to be rewarded and he gets another go at it. And it's pretty rough when you've been the premier to then go and be the opposition leader. The transition will be a difficult one, I expect, or
Mm.
whether they decide that it's a clean break and another person is best. So it'll be fascinating to watch.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a couple of other things I want to touch on before we move on to the next topic. One is nuclear, the coalition's nuclear policy, and the second is reproductive rights, and both link to the Queensland election, but I think also have implications federally. So to take nuclear first, Peter Dutton obviously has a plan, a nuclear power plan. Um, and David Crisafulli is opposed to it, the now state premier. Does this
Yeah,
create a
awkward
headache
a bit.
for Dutton?
Yeah, yeah, it does. Yes, I think so. And it will be very interesting to watch this dynamic, because the LNP leadership at the state level in Queensland is a far more moderate version of the LNP than Peter Dutton is. He's in the Conservative wing. David Crisafulli, sorry, is in the more moderate end, and the LNP's policy positioning has been a more moderate one, and it certainly at the state level has not been in favour of nuclear power, and they've made that very clear. And they've said, in fact, that they won't have nuclear reactor sites in Queensland. Well, I think Peter Dutton's got two. I think he's got two spots earmarked in Queensland, or at least one, to have a nuclear reactor site. So there are going to be some awkward conversations, and whether who wins out in that discussion is going to be fascinating. Whether Peter Dutton and his colleagues can persuade David Crisafulli to dial that opposition down in the interests of federal victory, or whether David Crisafulli says, I'm a newly elected premier, I need to do what I say. And in fact, he's been saying a lot since Saturday, we are going to do what we said we would do and not do what we said we would not do. And he adds that extra bit, whether he's going to dig in and say, no, we told the people of Queensland that we will not do this and we are not going to bend. So pass the popcorn. I reckon that is going to be quite an interesting dynamic to watch.
And the states, they do have a lot of control over energy policy as well. So, yeah, definitely something for Dutton to have to deal with. And the
And
other
he
thing,
has to change the law too. Don't forget, if he wins the
exactly.
federal election, it's banned in Australia, so it has to be legislated, and that is not going to be a straightforward process. So there's a lot of
Mm.
hurdles to get over. But at the very least, in the political sense, the first one is: does your mate in Queensland support what you're doing or not?
in your own state.
Yeah.
Um, the other thing that came up during the course of the Queensland election and has popped up elsewhere actually is abortion and reproductive rights. So they've been in the spotlight a lot in recent months. In South Australia, we saw an MP propose legislation that would essentially be forced birth legislation. Then in Queensland, Robbie Katter campaigned for this election on winding back reproductive rights and introducing a bill to that effect. These are currently state issues in Australia, and abortion is legal in every state. But is this kind of, are we seeing an importation of some of the US culture wars here for political purposes? What's your reading of how this reproductive rights have entered politics this year?
So it's very interesting. So I did a column about this on Saturday. I didn't actually talk about the US stuff because my colleagues, my editor and colleagues had talked about it in the podcast that they did on the Full Story podcast that they did on Friday. But of course, there's an obvious link that this is an issue that is igniting passions and opinions in the United States on both sides of the argument as a result of the winding back of Roe v. Wade by the Supreme Court. And so there's an argument that there are people who are supportive of winding back abortion rights in Australia who would take their cue from that and want to reignite the debate here. And I certainly think there are some people who I've described as true believers who, people who really do support that position and have strong concerns about legalised abortion, who are taking the opportunity of that discussion being raised in another country to raise it here. But I also think there are a range of other agendas kind of at play. And I was trying to describe some of those in this piece I wrote on the weekend, because in South Australia, it has also been quite a useful vehicle for some factional power plays within the Liberal Party. There's a seemingly eternal battle in South Australia between the sort of hard right end of the Liberal Party and the moderate end of the Liberal Party. And we saw some of the fruits of that in the Senate pre-selection contest in which we saw Anne Ruston, who's a more moderate Liberal, who has been a minister in the Morrison government, so more senior, being relegated to the second position, and having Alex Antic, a senator who's he's a backbencher, but he's a hard right senator, getting the numbers to be elevated to the top position on the Senate ticket. And that is a result of recruiting in the branches. And the way it's described to me is that it was, a direct legacy of this abortion debate coming up when it did 4 years ago. So there's an argument in some corners of the Liberal Party that part of this exercise, not to suggest that people don't genuinely believe in what they say when they put forward this legislation, I'm sure that they do, but that there's a secondary benefit some might see in a political sense of it being a recruiting tool, of getting some supporters of their position against legalised abortion or in favour of making changes like you described with that legislation about babies that, it's a terrible thing that might remain alive during a termination process of being forced to be born alive. And there's a real movement in the anti-abortion sort of movement at the moment to try and have that kind of legislation introduced around Australia, and that's the sort of legislation that Robbie Katter has proposed in Queensland as well. So I think there are a number of things going on, as well as seeking to use the US wave of debate here. There's also some sort of political manoeuvring going on here in Australia, using that debate as a useful tool, either for or against. And there's an argument with Queensland. Some in the Liberal National Party are convinced that there was some kind of wink and a nod arrangement with Labor and Robbie Katter. Now, Labor people absolutely strenuously deny all of that. I haven't put that to Robbie Katter, but they, given what we just talked about how whether the conviction thing gave a bit of a leg up, even if it was entirely serendipitous for Stephen Miles. So there's an argument that it might have worked politically quite well for them on that side, and maybe in South Australia it's working politically to the advantage of the other side.
Mm. And in the end, because David Crisafulli was asked whether or not he would support or oppose Robbie Katter's legislation, and I think over 100 times he kind of just dodged the question, if I'm not wrong. Did he end up committing one way or the other?
Well, he did in the end say, I think, that he was pro-choice. So he was sort of forced in the end to make a firmer call, and that was in that debate that they had just a few days before the election. But at the same time, coincidentally emerged, some comments he'd made that were basically the opposite of that some time earlier. So it did become an opportunity for his opponents to seek to wedge him, and he did struggle with that, because it's the sort of debate where the on the one hand, on the other hand argument doesn't fly very well. People say you
Mm.
either are or you aren't, in favour or against. So it was a difficult issue for him politically to manage, and not one he would have welcomed at that point.
Yeah. And we did see Senator Nampa Price told the Nine Papers, I think last week, that she can't agree with abortions beyond the first trimester, I believe. And in response, she got a bit of pushback from some senior coalition women. And I think even Matt Canavan, of all people, might have come out to kind of try and hose it down a little bit. That the coalition, isn't interested in winding back reproductive rights. What is going on there federally? Is there division? Is there, are they going to crack down on this and we won't hear any more about it? Is it going to be part of the election?
Well, good. All of these are excellent questions, Ebony. I think what happened was that Senator Nampa Price was putting a personal view. Given the debate that was raging last week in Queensland, a number of us who love a good conspiracy were saying, is this now a sanctioned statement at the federal level? Is this now a push to have this revisited at the federal level? And we were told, or I certainly was told very rapidly, no, it is not. And I think what you saw from the women that you mentioned, Susan Lee, the Deputy Liberal leader, Jane Hume, the Shadow Finance Minister, and in fact Bridget McKenzie, the Nationals National Senate leader, were all saying no. This is not being revisited. We have no. They started off with the "we have no plans," that fun phrase that we always suggest lives a crack of light. But I think by the end they were like, nah. And so that gave the distinct impression this was not a debate that they were wanting to reopen. You mentioned Matt Canavan, and I do think his intervention was interesting because he's on team anti-abortion, and he's in favour of introducing these babies born alive bills, and in fact has sponsored one such piece of legislation himself, which is just sitting there because it's a private senator's bill and the government's not going to want to progress it. But they did have a debate in the parliament a couple of months ago, that Ralph Babet, the United Australia senator, brought on, which was a way of sort of pointing back to that. And Matt Canavan was certainly in favour of that then. But in the end, he's from the LNP. It was a few days before that state election. I think he kind of read the room and worked out it wasn't going to be a good idea to be pushing that wagon at this point, and the LNP would not thank him if he had joined in the cheering of Robbie Katter and others, and even Senator Price at this point. So his intervention was fascinating because it was much more muted and benign and moderate
Mhm.
than he might be naturally inclined to, or than he had expressed in the past. And I reckon that was just being a pragmatist and saying we can't have this debate right now.
Yeah. And I mentioned that issue second because like it really has dominated US politics, particularly since the Supreme Court overturned Roe v. Wade. And yeah, I just thought it interesting, not only that it's kind of been imported here a little bit, but I don't think hits the same way. But yeah, it's just become a really massive issue and quite a potent one for the Democratic Party in the US presidential campaign, motivating a lot of women to turn out. And we've seen them amongst early voters in particular. But also like very genuine stakes for women in the states where abortion was repealed or overturned, leading to the deaths of a number of women or some horrific outcomes like not being able to have any future kids because their fertility was impacted by something going wrong and not being able to access the care that they need. So I just wonder, we're not that far out from the US election,
I think it's
but
8 days now, are we? Yeah, something
yeah,
like that.
exactly. Do you think this issue, like in swing states in particular, where turnout will be one of the critical things, does the evidence kind of look like it will be a really powerful motivator for to see a lot more women turn out, do you think?
Well, again, I don't profess to be a US politics expert. I am an engaged and interested observer with probably more than a healthy fascination, but don't profess to have expert knowledge other than that. But it is interesting to me how much of a galvanizing issue this is in the United States, and I'm sure it is partly because, or largely because, of that sort of role of the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court itself is controversial because of presidents having the capacity to put judges on, that are inclined to their political leanings, or that's the argument. And Donald Trump was able to appoint judges, and now we have this decision, and so the connection is sort of being made there. And then you have the roles of all the other states. But clearly, it is something that is exercising a lot of people's minds. And the fact that you have a contest between Donald Trump and Kamala Harris, a female candidate, again, and we haven't seen a female president in the US, this issue is naturally going to be one that is hit on by both candidates in different ways, focusing on different demographics. And, we all know they have a matrix of, right, here are the swing states. Who are the groups that we need to target? Where do we need to get out the vote more? And so I think the objective very much from the Harris camp has been to use this to activate women in particular, but people who are sympathetic to the argument in favour of abortion rights, to get out and vote, to boost the vote. There's been a lot said that maybe people who voted for Donald Trump last time are inclined to vote for him again, and so that the task for the Harris campaign, having come into the race late, and is to not only persuade but to get more people to vote than voted last time. And that is a doubly wicked challenge and difficult challenge when you do come into the campaign so late. I had a really
Mm.
interesting conversation. I do a podcast for The Guardian, and I had a recent conversation with a young guy called Corey Alpert, who is American and is out here doing a PhD at Melbourne University, but has worked in the Biden White House in the Harris office and been engaged with the campaign. And he was talking us through the stages of the campaign, and the last stage that we're in, and how once you get to October, it really flips from the persuasion arguments and the broad to the targeted getting out the vote. And that's what we're now seeing. And Kamala Harris is clearly very focused, particularly on using this issue to try and get people to vote, because the voting is open and they can go and vote early. And it's not as straightforward over there as it is here.
Mm.
Voting is a very complicated process and made more difficult by the rules in different states. Sometimes you've got to queue for 8 hours because there's one voting machine in the office that you're at. So they really have to work hard to get people to come out because it's not compulsory. And that's exactly what you're seeing. And this issue in particular is really one that they are using to try and activate that.
Mm. And the polls are still showing that it's a fairly close election result. And in recent weeks, we've seen Donald Trump, the Republican candidate, talking about, the enemy within. He's floated the idea of using the National Guard or even the military to deal with internal dissent. I mean, there's a very real prospect that he could be re-elected president. How worried should Australia be about the prospect of violence after the election and long term, if he does get elected, what that means for an alliance if we've got an ally with the president, enacting those kinds of authoritarian policies?
I think countries like Australia and its allies and like-minded that they describe, other democracies are watching very closely. It's sort of fascinating in a terrible way lately that we've seen so many former office bearers from the Trump administration who held national security positions coming out and offering an opinion on what Donald Trump represents. And you're hearing the word fascist and you're hearing the word dictator being used, which is incredible to me. Um, that would set alarm bells anywhere. I think here in this country, everybody who's engaged in politics, certainly in government and opposition, are watching very carefully to work out what it means for Australia on a number of levels. I think for democracies generally, it's what happens in the United States is going to be enormously significant, just as you said, for the institutions of democracy, for their stress testing those, the strength of those. Um, we've already seen change since the Trump era of the old assumptions about the way politicians behave, what they say, and the idea of what is truth. Some of those old assumptions no longer apply because they don't follow those old rules anymore. And that in itself is a massive challenge to democracy. But national security, look at the region that we're in, the issue of China and Taiwan, that has enormous implications for the world, and particularly a country like Australia in this region. If we were to find there was a flashpoint there, and what do we do? And what does the United States do? That's enormous. And the issue of climate change is also the result in the US is incredibly pivotal. And we've heard the climate change minister, Chris Bowen, here acknowledging recently that they're waiting to see how that US election goes because the government hasn't set a 2035 emissions reduction target yet. We've got the Conference of the Parties, the regular conference coming up in Azerbaijan in the next couple of weeks. So this decision in the US is going to have an impact on that. So on every level, from social unrest and the future of democracy to global security to the future of the planet to just what becomes acceptable in political discourse, all of that is going to be, tested and on trial on the 5th of November in the United States.
Yeah, because as you said, like it has been kind of shocking in a way, as well as encouraging, I guess, the number of former Trump staffers who are raising the alarm bell about some of his pronouncements and what kind of leader they see him being. There was his former chief of staff had talked about the fact that he was openly admiring, saying he needed generals who are as loyal as Hitler's. Like it's not small things that they're accusing him of, and it's not from regular opponents. Like these are people who worked for the Republican administration and, fairly senior people from the military. And yeah, that issue of what it means for America's allies to have someone like that in there. I know many in Europe, for example, are also worried if Trump wins, what it means for Ukraine. He's talked about doing a deal, like a peace deal with Russia and Ukraine, and what that means for Europe. I like the implications here are enormous. And while we see obviously candidates and from the right win oftentimes in elections across the world, someone who is so overtly kind of authoritarian in their approach and kind of making jokes about things that you don't really seem like jokes when it comes down to it. I mean, in his when he was first elected, we were kind of underprepared, I guess, or no one knew what it was going to be like. But yeah, it
Well,
feels like
everyone
this
was
time.
astonished. Like nobody expected
Exactly.
it. So I
Yeah.
think everyone was blindsided and everyone thought it couldn't happen because this is a kind of real estate mogul, billionaire, bit of a strange character, television star, versus Hillary Clinton. No way. And then suddenly all the rule books were thrown out, and he
Mm.
took advantage of that to the point you're making, and he's changed a lot of those rules and expectations. So yeah, we're all watching it.
And do you think, I don't know, it just strikes me that we seem ill prepared again this second time round. Like we've got a bigger idea of what will happen. But yeah, I'm really interested to see globally how other world leaders respond to it because, obviously the United States is such an important ally, but these are real red lines for a lot of democracies that we can't cross or even seem to be like endorsing in any way, which is, going to be very difficult to navigate should he be re-elected. So you've touched on a couple of issues there that Australia is considering, but do you have thoughts on the difference between a Trump presidency and a Harris presidency for Australia and for the alliance?
So for things like the AUKUS deal, I mean, it seems that, well, it was forged um, through the Biden presidency, and we would expect that the Harris presidency, if it comes to pass, would continue that. And on this side of the Pacific, the Labor government has picked up where the Morrison coalition government left off. So if that continues, love it or hate it, it looks like the AUKUS deal would stay in place. There's uncertainty, I suppose, around it in terms of Donald Trump, and this goes to this is where it's sort of this point crosses over everything really. The great thing about Donald Trump is that he is a disruptor, and some people argue that that's a positive thing. And I've had conversations with people whose views I respect in this country who know about US politics, who will put the counter view to the panicky view about a Trump presidency Mark II and say the impact on the Australian economy. And they will say, well, actually, you might find that the disruption is ends up being more positive for Australia economically than we think. And it's an interesting argument, and I listened to it. And the Chinese government might look at Trump and think, because he's unpredictable, and in some ways that can be its own superpower and strength when dealing with leaders of countries like China, that they might prefer a leader whose measure they think they have, to one whose measure they don't. Now, maybe that's true, maybe that's not, but he's unpredictable, and so people don't know in countries that are watching for the outcome exactly what he will do on a number of things, and they're trying to judge based on the things he said publicly. But the problem with him is he's completely contradictory sometimes in what he says. So you can't work out which is the real, policy position, and whether he'd stick to whether what he says during a campaign period in the lead up to an election would be what he does afterwards. I'm not sure that anyone is certain about that. So to the AUKUS point, he'll be very focused on US defence and its ability to defend itself. And I think if he thinks that somehow the United States building submarines for Australia is going to undermine its manufacturing of its own submarines, and that's been a live issue in the Congress, then
Mm.
who knows? Maybe there is a problem with the AUKUS deal for Australia. So things like that, I think, are exercising a lot of minds, certainly on this side of the Pacific, trying to work out what exactly the position is going to be. And hopefully they're not just waiting till it all gets thrown up in the air and lands on the ground to make those kind of judgments. Hopefully they're strategizing on a range of, and of course they will be strategizing on a range of possible outcomes and how to approach whoever wins. And there'll be a greater degree of continuity, obviously, in our bilateral ties, and a greater degree of certainty in the alliance. As again, whatever view you might have of it, it'll be more similar to the way it is now if Kamala Harris is elected than if Donald Trump wins next
Mm.
Tuesday.
Just before we go to questions from the audience, a couple of other things on the Australian domestic federal politics agenda. One is this issue of the Chairman's Lounge for the Prime Minister. For those who haven't been following along, can you just explain what has happened here?
Yeah, so a former Financial Review columnist by the name of Joe Aston has published a book in the last couple of days, and extracts of that were published in the Nine newspapers on the weekend, and it's called The Chairman's Lounge. And it talks about the airline Qantas in particular, and Qantas's relationship with government in particular, and the favours that it gets, and the favours that it allegedly gives. And a lot of the focus in the last couple of days has been on the Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese's relationship with the former Chief Executive of Qantas, Alan Joyce. And there's been a lot of suggestion in the public domain over the last year or so that they had a close relationship. There's been public debate about whether how involved he was or was not in the decision to restrict Qatar or reject Qatar Airways' application for extra landing slots at Sydney Airport. And the Prime Minister has rejected suggestion that he had any engagement with that. But what has emerged in these extracts is the suggestion, the direct allegation that he was very close with Alan Joyce, and that during his time as allegedly as Transport Minister and or as Shadow Transport Minister, but in the portfolio of Transport, that he allegedly had contacted Alan Joyce directly to ask to be upgraded on flights that he was taking for personal reasons, for family reasons. Now, Joe Aston has said he absolutely stands by the sources on that he solicited help from Alan Joyce directly. And it's opened up this whole debate about the perks that politicians get. And we certainly know that they get upgrades, and they get access to this very exclusive lounge, the Chairman's Lounge, which Joe Aston says is unique in Australia. And Virgin has a version of that too in response to the Qantas version. And it's a very elite club. All the members of federal parliament are offered membership to it. Chief executives, judges, people in high office in Australia, in the corporate world as well, people whose companies spend a lot of money with Qantas, people who are deemed to be, senior enough to justify being in this very small club, exclusive club, and they can use this exclusive lounge before they fly. They get basically valet service. They get upgrades when available. All the perks that flow from that. That is the sort of thing around this. The sort of theme around which this book is written, but this point about the upgrades and whether or not Anthony Albanese actually asked for them is become a live debate ongoing. Now, he has responded on the weekend and said that he has declared every upgrade that he received in the Register of Interests. There's been some debate, the Register of Members' Interests. There's been some debate about whether or not there were some that his then wife, now ex-wife, might have been given that weren't declared. That is floating around, and he may, I confess I haven't heard all of the responses this morning. He may have responded directly to that. I haven't seen that, but there are questions about this issue of whether upgrades were solicited, and some, now every minister is being asked, did you get upgrades and did you ask for them? And the asking for them is the question. And the opposition is zeroing in on the fact that he may have been in the transport portfolio, and that Qantas is one of the biggest stakeholders in that portfolio. And did he ask for favours effectively? And what, if anything, arose as a result of that, if indeed it occurred? So this is this very live debate. And we're going into a week next week where the House of Representatives will be sitting and the Senate will be in estimates committees. And we know we love journalists. We love estimates. We love them and hate them because they go until the wee small hours, but they always extract fascinating bits of information. And you can be sure that opposition senators are absolutely gagging to be asking questions of government Senate ministers about this issue and whether or not, and trying to just zero in on whether or not the Anthony Albanese actually asked for these upgrades.
I'm going to go now to questions from the audience. Thanks, everyone. Don't forget you can type your questions for Karen in the Q&A box here. The first one is from Kathy Bowles, who says that she's read that Labor's focus on attacking the Greens was one of the factors that led to their loss. Do you have an opinion on that?
That's certainly the argument the Greens are making. So we heard from Adam Bandt and his housing spokesperson, Max Chandler Mather, yesterday, and they were making that argument that they believe that because Labor isn't focused on what they would, I think, describe as the real enemy, which is the coalition parties, the Conservative parties, and have put so much energy into fighting the Greens, that that is part of the reason they lost. Now, that's an argument. It's a live argument. I think there's a big argument in Queensland about the it's time thing, that Labor had been in office for a long time, and sometimes that's just hard to fight back against. But there's a flip side to what the Greens are arguing, which is what Labor and other critics of the Greens are arguing, which is that this could also be seen as a reflection of how the Greens have positioned themselves and campaigned at the national level. We saw in the ACT that, which was the election, the most recent other state and territory level election, where the Greens went backwards in terms of their representation. They've lost their seats there, a couple of seats there to independents, it seems. So now you've got two elections at the lower level of government where the Greens have not done as well as they had hoped. And in both cases, they had been talking a big game and saying they were expecting to increase their vote. So that will have been a disappointment to Greens. And the question is, and it certainly does serve Labor's interests to put this point loudly, is it the sort of more aggressive stance of the Greens against Labor? So it's sort of the reverse of what the Greens are saying. They're saying it's Labor's aggressive stance towards them that's the problem. Labor is saying, well, it's the Greens' aggressive stance towards us that's annoying people, because people who are inclined to vote in a progressive direction want, in the end, cooperation more than they want obstruction. And of course, the Labor government is saying, and we use the example, say, of the housing bills that are stuck in the Senate, they're blaming the Greens in particular. The coalition is also not supporting them, but they're blaming the Greens in particular and saying, you are obstructing our agenda. And they are making the argument that voters are now turning away from the Greens, and this is just their argument, because they say, well, in the end, we expect the Greens to ultimately support a progressive agenda, not take steps that will help deliver a conservative government, not a progressive government. So all of these arguments are now live. But if I was the Greens, I'd be looking at the landscape and being a bit worried that you've now seen in two places your seats going backwards, and wondering how you can avoid that at the federal election. Because you can be sure, as we talked about before with those seats in Brisbane in particular, and the Prime Minister does seem quite obsessed with Max Chandler Mather, and really Max does get under the Prime Minister's skin quite a bit. Maybe he sees a little bit of himself historically in the young firebrand, I don't know. But they do seem very focused on trying to get those seats back in particular. So this contest will continue in various forms, but it's challenging for the Greens to work out, do they need to adjust the approach they're taking federally? Is that the message? Is that not the message? And what should they do in response to these two results? And it is a challenge, because we're only a few months out from a federal election now too.
The next question is from Elizabeth Robinson, and I think probably referring to our discussion about the United States election, and asking why candidates from both political parties are supportive of the genocide in Gaza. We know that's another issue, again, that perhaps will affect turnout and damaging, certainly probably more to the Democrats than it might be to the Republicans there. But again, quite a potent election issue in the United States, I would think. Any observations on that, Karen?
Well, and a potent issue here too, right? It is something that has really exercised, engaged, enlivened, and distressed people around the world, and certainly in the United States. It's a complicated issue in all countries, well, everywhere, particularly in the Middle East, but everywhere it's a complicated issue, and it has really divided a lot of people. And so it's interesting in the US context, if that's the context of the question, looking at where this issue is going to rank in some of those swing states. And there are some swing states where this is a very live issue that is getting a lot of coverage, and that may well affect particular blocks of demographics of voters. So whereas we would, certainly in this country and even there, I think we wouldn't often see a foreign affairs issue being the thing that might swing people's votes. It's not usually that. It's usually more the hip pocket type issues, economic issues, and foreign affairs in the sense of our own national security, but not foreign affairs in the sense of a view about something happening overseas. we've seen passionate views about wars in the past, about Iraq and about Afghanistan and the like. But in the end, there hasn't been so much evidence that it is the thing that swings votes. But in some parts of the US, it may well. And we've heard debate here too in some electorates where there are communities that are particularly directly affected, whether they be communities of Jewish Australians and people who support Israel, or communities of Australians who are Muslim or have deep concern about what's happening in Gaza from the point of view of the Palestinians. That may well have an influence on a greater influence on voting at our federal election than you might normally expect. So it's certainly an issue that is a part of the conversation about in the US and here, heading to our federal election. And there has certainly been criticisms made, of leaders that they are not doing enough for whichever position the critic holds. And in this country, we heard people say, to the word genocide was used. We've certainly heard the criticism made that the opposition is very much behind Israel, and we've heard the criticism made from people who are distressed about Gaza that they don't think the government has taken a strong enough stance. It's one of the things that the government is battling against, trying to balance the diplomatic responsibilities with the domestic political imperatives and with the criticisms it's getting. It's a massively volatile and distressing issue, and it's a real issue for politicians, I think.
Mm. And I just add on the top of that, in terms of turnout in the US, I think in the last 24 hours there was that Trump rally at which a comedian made very a joke in very poor taste about Puerto Rico being a garbage dump, and a lot of observations of the number of Puerto Ricans who are not Puerto Ricans who have registered to vote in various swing states, and the impacts that might have as well. So another one to keep an eye on.
And remember, we heard the Trump assertion apparently that came from JD Vance, his running mate, that was it Haitian migrants are supposed to have been sort of eating cats and dogs.
Yeah.
There is a theme there, right, of language that is designed to denigrate people of particular heritages, and the worry about that being given kind of credence and airtime, and this is my personal view now, is that it gives permission for these kinds of views to be put and to be escalated. And we see, as we said with the abortion debate, we see that some of those things get imported to here. And that's another question in terms of the social fabric, depending on what the result is next week. If there is a President Trump Mark II, does that then give permission for people who hold views that normally are not expressed in public, that are prejudicial views against cohorts of people? Do they then have permission to express those views in a more open way in this country? We'll see.
The next question is from Roger Tonkin, who says, should pre-polling be shorter?
Well, this is the point. So Annika Wells, as I mentioned earlier, her view in the wonderful Saturday night window of frankness was that there should only be 1 week of pre-poll voting, not 2 or 3 weeks. And it's an open question. I think a lot of people think it's really convenient to be able to vote earlier, and that's obvious from the numbers of people who are doing it. Certainly the community organisations that sell the democracy sausage in the schoolyard on the day are not happy that people are voting early, because they're losing revenue, and there's an argument that it's changing the nature of that event, the festival of democracy, as I like to call it. But it's a matter of convenience for people, and I think it's going to be hard to undo that. And in a country where you're requiring people to vote, I suppose you have a degree of obligation to make it as possible as you can for them to do that easily. Having said that, it does, when you have a designated election campaign period that has a sort of an arc to it, and traditionally the parties like to have their launch like about a week before everyone votes, it does mean that people are going to the polls without having heard all the arguments. And then we go back to what we said before, is whose fault is that exactly? I'm not sure.
Yeah, but also, Australia is not the same as the United States. Like their elections are held on a Tuesday. It's often difficult for people who are working to access and vote, which we don't do here in Australia. But I'm sure it will I'm sure it will be debated at great length.
Yeah,
Um,
and the state arrangements in the US mean that, as we sort of touched on before, state by state, there are a lot more obstacles. There are a lot more things that make it hard for people to vote, and you do wonder in some states in the US whether they're designed to do that, to
mm,
discourage particular cohorts of people from voting, because that has its own outcome in the end.
yeah, that's right. Um, Roger asked about the implications for a Trump win in the US presidential debate for US presidential election for Australia, which we've already touched on. But again, another question about uh, from Elizabeth around a Trump view, which is what's wrong with the peace deal with Russia? Nearly, well, tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, Ukraine's killed in the war. Um, I guess if we can tackle that question, Karen, it's not the idea of a peace deal that's the problem. Everyone would prefer peace rather than war. But I guess the question for Europe is, what does Ukraine have to give up in that kind of scenario? And what are then the implications for Russia's plans for the rest of Europe would be at concern there.
Yeah, and I think the speculation about a Trump presidency and the relationship with Russia is a complete capitulation to what Vladimir Putin wants, which would be no more Ukraine and Russia succeeding in its objective to take over the country, and also what is the nature of former President Trump's relationship with President Putin. What are the quid pro quos that go on in a discussion about that, and what does it mean to effectively strengthen Vladimir Putin's position in the world, if to achieve the end of the war by that means. So a peace deal, yes, on the face of it, everybody wants the war to end, but at what cost? The cost is already massively high, but the cost could be higher, and so I think, yeah, there's a question about what motivates Donald Trump in his relationship with Vladimir Putin, what goes on that we haven't seen, and what would be offered in each direction. And is that good for the democratic system in the US and for the rest of the world if someone of the nature of Vladimir Putin is elevated and strengthened when, large sections of the world have taken the view by their governments that this is not behaviour that should be rewarded, i.e., that a country can invade another country and take over. And there are certainly arguments that it forms a test case for other parts of the world, like, say, China and Taiwan.
Mm,
So, large parts of the world have taken the view that it's very important to resist what Russia is doing in Ukraine because of what it means in that instance to Ukraine, but also what it means more broadly and what it says about what countries can get away with and are allowed to do. So I think, there is a live question about what it would mean if Donald Trump was to say, sure, off you go.
mm. Sophia McGreen asked about don't forget that the nuclear issue won't be a live issue for Crisafulli unless Dutton actually wins the next federal election. And also someone asking about the results of the parliamentary inquiry on nuclear energy, which is happening at the moment. So circling back to nuclear on those two things.
So I disagree that it won't be an issue for David Crisafulli until after, if Dutton wins. It'll be certainly an issue in terms of, the practicalities of implementing the policy, but it's an issue now in a political sense because David Crisafulli is going to have to take a position in relation to Peter Dutton's nuclear plan ahead of the election, and it's a story. If he capitulates and says, "Okay, you can build. If you win, you can build reactors in my state," and it's a story from a journalistic point of view and in a public interest point of view. Either way, it's a story. If he says, "No, I'm sorry, you can't," because that's a problem for Peter Dutton. At the moment, we haven't seen the detail of his plan. We've seen the basics of it, and that he's making an argument that it will be better in the long term, cheaper, cleaner, and it would be at these particular 7 locations. But we don't know how much it would cost. We still don't really know the timeline. There's a lot we don't know. So I would argue it is significant, the position that David Crisafulli takes, and all the state and territory leaders take in the lead up, because it tells us whether this plan ever can actually be implemented or not, or whether in fact the plan they're putting forward has to be changed or has to be abandoned because it can't be implemented. So that's significant. In terms of the inquiry that's going on at the moment, well, I'm a little bit cynical here. I did do a spot on Radio National this morning. We were talking about it there too, and I did make the note that you might remember back in 2018, 2019, the then Morrison government ran a parliamentary inquiry into proposals to dismantle the system of franking credits. And what that would mean, well, that was seen correctly as being a political exercise designed to provide a platform to tear apart Labor's policy on franking credits. Now, whether you can credit that inquiry with the Labor's failure at the coming election, who knows? But it certainly created an opportunity for the coalition of people to criticise the Labor policy under the guise of an inquiry. And look, much the same thing is happening now. This nuclear energy inquiry, and Labor absolutely condemned that as a shameless exercise in using taxpayers' money to run an inquiry about an opposition policy. And that's exactly what's happening now with Labor in power. This nuclear energy policy inquiry is designed to do that. But the question is whether it's working as well as they want it to, or whether it's actually also providing a platform for people arguing in favour of nuclear energy. And you are seeing a little bit of both. So in the last day or so, when we heard the second day of hearings, you had someone from Canada saying, no, what Peter Dutton has been saying is completely wrong. It hasn't driven prices down in the way that he says in Canada, which he keeps using that as an example. And you had someone who was a former senior official in one of the nuclear science bodies in Australia saying, actually, maybe he could implement this plan within the time frame that he says, which is, Labor has spent a lot of energy saying that he couldn't. So it could go well for them in a political sense, like the other one did for the Morrison government, or there could be an opportunity to give the other voices a go as well. We'll see.
I always just have to laugh at this idea that they would get elected and be able to implement it within the time frame that they've specified, when they couldn't even do the car parks. That's what I always come back to.
Commuter car parks, yes.
Yeah, nuclear power plants quite a bit more complicated than a few car parks around the place. But perhaps I don't have enough faith. I think we are going to have to wrap it up there. Thanks very much, everyone, for your wonderful questions. Sorry we couldn't get to all of them. And thank you, Karen, for your time today. We really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me. Sorry, I'm a bit long-winded in my answers. Apologies to the people whose questions didn't get asked.
Not at all. And thanks to everyone who tuned in today. Don't forget, you will be able to find a copy of the recording on our YouTube channel later today. And don't forget to subscribe to the Australia Institute, all our podcasts. We've got Follow the Money, which I host, where we unpack politics, policy, and economics. Dollars and Cents with Greg Jericho, and After America, which will be releasing daily episodes in the lead up to the US election. That's with Dr. Emma Shortis. And head on over to the australiainstitute.org.au to find all our upcoming webinars and research, and over onto our socials, where you can see our very own research director, Rod Campbell, who appeared yesterday before the inquiry into nuclear power. So thanks again, Karen. You can read Karen's amazing analysis over at Guardian Australia, and we'll see you again soon. Thanks so much, Karen.
Thanks for having me.
Bye. Thanks for watching. If you'd like to keep up to date with all our latest research and work, sign up to our newsletter. Delivered every fortnight, it includes behind-the-scenes updates from Richard Dennis, an exclusive cartoon from Judy Horacek, details for our upcoming events and webinars, as well as explainers, graphs, and not to mention the latest cutting-edge research and analysis from the team here on the key issues that are facing Australia. Click the button on your screen to check it out.